Welcome grade 11s. Today's session is about interest. My name is Hayley and I'm going to be taking you through the session. Let's see what we're going to be doing today. Our key concepts. We're going to be focusing on and summarizing what you need to know about interest in general, about simple interest, and then about compound interest. Let's go through for our explanations. So first of all, what is interest? When we borrow money from a bank, we have to pay interest to the bank or financial institution. This is how the bank makes their money. The amount of interest we pay on the money we borrowed depends on a few things. So what does it depend on? It depends on the amount we borrow, also called the principal or sum or principal amount. It depends on the length of time that we borrow the money for. Kind of the longer we borrow the money for, the more interest we're going to pay. It also depends on the current interest rate. So different banks charge different interest rates for different kinds of loans. When we borrow money, we want the lowest interest rate possible because we're going to have to pay back that interest. So we want it as low as possible. If we're going to save our money in an institution or a bank, then we're also going to earn interest on our money. And in this case, when we save money, we want the highest interest rate possible. We want to make the most amount of money we can on our principal sum. The amount of interest earned, let me move that up a little bit. The amount of interest earned or paid is always calculated as the accumulated amount, that's your final amount that you have in the bank or that you owe, less the principal amount. So, or the amount that we borrowed. So what I'm trying to say is that at the end of the day, we have an accumulated amount of money, which we call A, which basically is our principal that we started with, plus the interest. So by pure manipulation of this formula, I get that my interest is actually my accumulated amount at the end minus my principal. And that is those two are important facts to remember when answering the questions, because they'll tell you, sometimes your question will be specific, how much interest did we earn? So let's go through to simple interest. Simple interest is the interest when you pay or earn on the original amount only. It is never changes. So your interest on that original amount stays the same for the entire length that you've borrowed or invested your amount of money. It is calculated as a percentage of the amount borrowed or invested and is the same year on year. There are two different calculations that you can use with simple interest. If you want to calculate the simple interest amount, you use the following formula. That is, your simple interest is equal to your principal amount times the interest rate per annum times the number of years. So we've just, right, SI is the simple interest, P is the principal amount, that's the amount you borrowed or invested, I is the interest rate being used as a percent per annum, and N is time in years that you borrowed your investment for. To calculate the total amount paid, that is the interest plus the original amount, you can use the following formula where you've got an A in it. A is your total amount that you have at the end of your period is equal to your principal amount, and then you've got these brackets where you've got 1 plus the interest rate again per annum, that's as a percentage, times the number of years. So I know these formulas look fairly complicated right now, so let's do an example and try and simplify it a little bit. Let's look at our first example. Peter invests 1,000 Rand at 8% simple interest per annum. How much interest does he earn after 10 years? Now read the question carefully. It says, how much interest does he earn after 10 years? So we are looking for the interest amount, and we can use our first formula. That is our formula over there. Now, when you're calculating these calculations, let's do it over here. What I want you to do is I want you to set out your work in a very specific way. And you might not have been doing this the whole year, but if you can learn to do it now, then it is a good idea. It makes it easier. So what I want you to do is I want you to write out the formula that you're going to be using. So we're going to be using this formula. And then I want you to basically write out each one of the values that we need. So everything that is in the formula, I'm then writing below the formula. And this way, it's going to make it easier for you to actually understand what needs to be substituted into the formula. So we're going to go through the question and see, well, how much interest does he earn? That's what I'm trying to calculate. So let's mark it with a question mark. He started with, let's go back to the question, he had 1,000 Rand. So that is my principal amount, 1,000 Rand. The interest rate, what was our interest rate? 8%. Our interest rate was 8%, and the number of years was 10 years. I'm just going to go double check that. 10 years. Right. Before you start substituting into your equation, I want you to convert two things. First of all, your interest rate, I want you to actually write it as a fraction. So 8% means it is 8 over 100. Your number of years, I want you to make sure that you actually have this in years. So sometimes they're going to give you a question where you've got months and you need to convert it to years. So let's just do a quick example on the side here. Let's say, for example, I said 18 months. How are we going to convert that to years? Well, we're going to divide by 12 because there's 12 months in a year, and we're going to get an answer of 1.5 years. So that would be the number that I put into my N. So let's delete that now that I've explained it. Now we've got everything set out. All we need to do is substitute into the formula. So I've got my SR is equal to 1,000, no bracket for this one, 1,000 times by, I'm going to make it 8 over 100 times by 10 years. Now your calculator can do all the fractions for you, so you don't have to worry that it looks complicated here, because all we're going to do is we're going to substitute that into the calculator. So let's do the calculation. Let's find our calculator. So we had 1,000 times by a fraction, 8%, which is 8 over 100, times by the number of years, and we get an answer of 800 Rand. So let's go back to here, and we write that in as 800 Rand. That is the interest that Peter earned on his investment after 10 years. Right, let's move on to the second part of the question. What is the total investment worth after 10 years? Now we're looking for our accumulated value, or A. So I'm going to do the same thing that I did earlier with writing it out. First, I'm going to write out my formula. So A equals to P. Now we've got 1 plus IN, close bracket. And again, I'm going to write out all these values. So I'm looking for A, for P, for I, and for N. My accumulated amount is what I want at the end, and that was my question. My principal was the same. That was my 1,000 Rand. My interest rate was 8%. Again, I want you to write it as a fraction. And my time was 10 years. And now we can substitute everything into the equation. So I've got A is equal to my principal of 1,000, open my brackets, 1 plus. Now I've got I times N, but I was 8 over 100 times by 10. Your calculator is going to do that all for you, so you don't have to worry that you've got a fraction and that it looks a little bit untidy. So let's get our calculator out and see what that answer is. At this stage, do you think that you can guess what the answer would be? Remember, I told you your accumulated value is your principal plus the interest. So if he started with 1,000 Rand and he earned 800 Rand in interest, what are we expecting this to be? We're expecting him to have 1,800 Rand. Let's see if our calculation actually gives us that answer. So we're going to have 1,000 Rand, open my brackets, 1 plus a fraction. I've got 8%, and then times by the number of years. Don't forget to close your bracket and press equals 1,800 Rand, exactly what I was expecting it to be. So let's go back to that, write it in. So we have 1,800 Rand. And don't forget to add the Rand value. That unit is very important. Before I carry on, I just want to go back to my calculation and show you what ends up happening, especially when you do a little bit more complicated calculations. So I've typed in everything and I press equals. Okay, in this case it's not going to work. We'll have to do it when we do the compound interest, it will work. If you get a syntax error, when you do these calculations, you've normally left out one of the brackets. So, okay, we'll try that again later. Right, let's move on to compound interest. Now, compound interest is a little bit more complicated. And the reason it is a little bit more complicated is, first of all, this is the most common type of interest that you earn. Financial institutions use, your banks, your banks use them, people that you borrow money from use compound interest. It basically means that your interest is earned or charged, is added to the principal amount, and then your interest is earned or charged on interest. So you have your lump sum, your original principal, you add interest to that. Let's just do it like this. I'll just draw it over here. So you have your principal amount, and then we take, let's do a different color. We add a little bit of interest to that. Then interest is calculated again. So we end up with interest on that. And we keep changing the amount of our principal. So we're earning interest on interest, or we're paying interest on interest. We're going to use the following formula. Right. A, which is our accumulated value, our final amount, is equal to the principal amount, and then you open your brackets, you've got 1 plus the interest rate that you earn or you're being charged for that payment interval. I'll come back to that now. And then all to the power of n, which is the number of compound periods. So in this case, we don't have the number of years and we don't have interest per annum. We've got interest per compound period. So basically the ones I need to look at now are just your I and your N and what you need to do to calculate them. So when interest is compounded more than once a year or more than annually, you have to first calculate I and N in the following way. So let's see how we're going to calculate it. Where interest is calculated biannually, I is the interest rate per annum divided by 2. And N will be twice a year. So let me try and explain that a little bit better. Right. If I've got my interest rate, let's look, for example, as I earn 12% interest per annum. If my interest is being charged biannually, that means it's being charged twice in the year. I'm not being charged 12% each time I am actually being charged interest. I'm being charged my interest rate for the year, but divided by how many times in the year am I being charged interest. So I'm going to take my 12% and divide it by 2. So in this case, I'm basically getting 6% charged per compound period. Then my N that I need to calculate, my N is no longer 1 year. It is now 1 year times by 2 because I'm being compounded twice in the year. So my I is the interest rate per compound period, and my N is the number of periods in the time that I've invested. So let's look at if interest is calculated quarterly. Quarterly means 4 times in the year. So we're going to take our interest rate and divide it by 4. So let's do our example of, let's just delete that. If it was 4 times a year, I'm going to take my interest rate divided by 4, which basically gives me 3% per compound period. And then how many times in a year am I being compounded? Well, in that case, it's 1 times 4. So N is 4 per year. Interest is calculated monthly. We have our interest rate for the year and divided by 12 because we have 12 months in a year. So in this case, we would take our 12, let's delete that, and we would divide it by 12, and we're basically paying 1% per month. So 12 times in the year, we're getting charged 1% or paying 1%, and how many compound periods? We would basically have 1 times 12, or we would have 12 of those. So I hope that makes sense. Now, these are the most common forms of compounding that you would get. So let's do an example and let's see what happens with the example. Pumi invests 20,000 rands worth of shares in a publishing house. If she earns 12% per annum compound interest, what will the value of her investment be after 5 years? Now, if they don't tell you that it's being compounded more than once in the year, you assume that it is compounded annually. So let's do that calculation. Let's get some more space here. Right, so I'm going to start off, there was an A. I'm going to start off with my formula. So A is equal to P, open bracket 1 plus my I to the power of N. Then I'm going to write out all my values that I need and do the same thing I did for my simple interest. So we're looking for what her interest is, what her investment is worth after 5 years. So I'm looking for A. The principal amount she had was 20,000 rand. So I'm going to make that 20,000 rand is my principal. Her interest rate that she was charged was 12%. Again, I'm going to write it as 12 over 100. And then the time frame was 5 years. Don't have to worry about changing I and N because it is compounded annually. What I'm going to do now is substitute that into my equation. So my principal is, my accumulated is equal to my principal, 1 plus my interest rate as a fraction to the power of 5. And now your calculator can do all the rest for you, so let's have a look at where our calculator does this. Okay, so we start off, we say 20,000. Open my brackets, and then 1 plus, and I can use a fraction button. So my percentage was 12 to the over 100. And then don't forget to close your brackets. To the power of 5, we use this little button over here. Gives me a power, and then I can type in the number 5. And now I've typed in everything and it looks exactly the same as it did on the board. Press equals and I end up with 35,246 and 83 cents. So let's write that in. So back to our notes. So she earned 35,246 rand and 83 cents. And that's what her money is worth after the 5 years. Now let's go to the second part of this question. Second part of this question, Pumi invests her 20,000 rands worth of shares in a publishing house. It looks exactly the same. We've still got our principal of 20,000 and she's investing it in the same place. She earns 12% per annum compound interest. Exactly the same. So what have they added? They've added this compounded monthly. What will the value of investment be after 5 years? So we've now got it compounded monthly. So the first thing I'm going to do when I start this calculation is basically say it's compounded monthly, and I'm going to make a note that there are 12 months in a year. So her money is being compounded 12 times. So we write out our formula first. So A is equal to P, 1 plus I to the power of N. Again, I'm going to fill in all my details that I've got. So A, P, let's move down a little bit, I and N. I know this seems like it takes a lot of time for me to actually do it this way, but I promise you in the long run it's actually going to save you time, because you are not going back to the question every time to check what am I substituting in now. So it might seem like it takes time, but it saves you in the long run. Right, she invested was 20,000 Rand. Her interest rate was 12%, and the number of years was 5. But now I'm going to go back and check with this 12. So where does my 12 come in? Well, first of all, my interest rate, I'm going to write it as 12 over 100. But now I need to divide this by 12. So what I can do is basically say, well, it's 12 divided by 100 times 12. That basically is going to account for dividing this by 12. And my number of years was not 5 years, it was 5 times 12, because it was 12 times in the year, and you can use your calculator if you need to do this with your calculator, but it is compounded 60 times in that period. Now we're going to substitute this into the, well, first we're going to write it out. So let's write it out at the bottom here. So A is now equal to my 20,000, open my bracket, 1 plus. And now I'm just going to write this fraction exactly the way it's written here, because my calculator can do this for me. Close brackets and to the power of 60. Or if you'd like, your calculator can still do 5 times 12 for you. So you don't have to calculate it first, but either way works. So now let's get our calculator out, and we start with our 20,000. Open my brackets. 1 plus, now I've got my fraction. So my fraction was 12%, and I had it over 100, but I needed to divide it by 12. So I'm going to times my denominator by 12, close my bracket, to the power of, and here you can say 5 times 12, or alternatively, let's make it 60, and equals. And what do we get? We get our answer of 36,333 Rand and 93 cents. So don't forget we're dealing with Rand, so we need to go to 2 decimal places. So let's write that answer in. So our solution now is, well, A is equal to 36,333 and 93 cents. And that is your answer of compounded monthly. Now let's just quickly compare these two values. In the first value, she earned 35,200 odd Rand, and now she has earned 36,000. So that compounding on a more regular basis than annually actually makes a difference. Why? Because we're earning interest on interest. So even though the 12% interest that she's earning is monthly, so she's actually only earning 1% interest per month, it compounds, because every time we add it, we're now including it on working out our interest on a bigger amount. So it's not much bigger, 1%, but it does make quite a bit of difference to my answer. So my 35,000 to 36,000. So this is something for you to note. If you're investing money, you want them to compound your monthly as often as possible. If you're borrowing money, well, you'd like them to compound it never, but if you have to have compound interest, then get them to compound it annually or as far away from each other as possible. Right, let's now go and do some questions. The table below is an extract from a letter from Sam Low to Mr. Chabalala. It shows the amounts that are available on instant loan from Sam Low and the repayments involved. These are one of these letters that you normally get in your postbox. Borrow money and you have to pay back a certain amount per month. But let's go through this letter. Well, clearly the letter went to Mr. Cohen and not to Mr. Chabalala, but let's see what the letter said. As a valued Sam Low customer, we are pleased to be able to offer you a personal loan the following rates. So they're offering him a loan. Let's analyze the table carefully. We've got a loan amount, and there are 4 different amounts for that. So he can borrow 4,000, 8,000, 16,000 and 25,000 Rand. Then we've got a payment plan. So if he borrows the money for 24 months, then these are the amounts that he needs to pay for each one. So let's look at 4,000 Rand. If he borrows 4,000 Rand, over 24 months, he needs to pay back 229 Rand per month. Over 36 months, it will be 174 Rand a month. 48 months, longer, he needs to pay back less. And over 60 months, still a longer period, and he pays back less. This is all on the original 4,000 Rand that he borrowed. These loan repayments conveniently include a monthly premium of 3.95 Rand per 1,000 Rand. So that's included in your monthly repayment. And a monthly administration fee of 9.50 Rand for your option personal protection plan. Right, now that we've analysed what the question actually says, or what the table stands for, let's see what kind of questions they want us to answer. So, if Mr. Chabalala chooses to borrow 16,000 Rand from Samlo, calculate how much he will finally repay if he takes the loan after over 24 months. So, we're looking at our 16,000, so let's delete all of these little scribblings. We're only looking at 16,000 Rand. Right, and he borrows it, he wants to repay over 24 months. So he's borrowing 16,000, he's repaying over 24 months, he's going to be paying 864 Rand per month. So what does the question actually ask? The question asks, how much will he finally repay if he takes it over 24 months? So we're going to take our 24 months that he's repaying for, and we're going to multiply it by the amount that he is paying every month, which is our 864. So we're going to times that by 864, and we're going to do that on the calculator. So we've got 24 months times 864 Rand, and he's repaying 20,736 Rand. So he's repaying, with a pen, 20,736 Rand. So that is the final amount that he pays for the bank for borrowing 16,000 Rand. So the balance between these two amounts of money is the actual interest that he paid. Let's see how much he has to pay if he's got 60 months. So we're going to take our 60, but we're no longer timesing by 864. We're going to our list and seeing where 60 months is. He's actually only paying 470 Rand. So we're going to times that by 470 Rand, and let's get an answer for that in your calculator. So we've got our 60 months times 470 Rand, and he pays back 28,200. So go back to here. Oops, the Rand. 28,200 is what he pays back in interest. Now he's paying back a larger amount of money because he's taken the loan for a longer period, so he's had to pay back more interest. So then the question says, in general, do you advise him to borrow for a longer or shorter period of time? And give a reason for your answer. Now, whenever you're asked to give a reason for your answer, I want you to use your common sense to try and answer these kind of questions. Do you advise him to take a shorter, which he will end up paying 20,000, or longer, where he'll be paying 28,000? Now, your instinct, I know, is going to be to say, well, pay for the shorter period. And why do we want the shorter period? So let's give our reason, because we've got to give a reason for this. Shorter period because he has to pay back less. It's basically cheaper for him. He has to pay back less of an amount. So, and that's a valid answer. But I want you to also try and think like outside of the box. What happens if I say, I suggest that he takes it for a longer period? Now, why would I do that? He's paying for a longer period, he's paying more money. So why then would I say to him, no, but I recommend that you take it for a longer period? And I'll tell you now, we're going to compare that amount to that amount. If he takes the loan for a longer period, he's paying less back each month. Now, he might be in a position where 470 Rand is far easier for him to find every month than it is to find 864. So I'm going to say, well, take it for a longer period. That's because you pay back less every month. Now I know he's going to be paying for a longer period, but maybe he can afford 470 Rand every month as opposed to 860. So think about these kind of things that are not direct, simple, in-your-face kind of solutions. The other reason we could have given for paying for a shorter period, well, after 2 years, 24 months, then your payment is done, finished, dusted, and you can now go maybe borrow more or carry on with life. Whereas if you're paying for 60 months, that's a full 5 years that you have to pay 470 Rand every month. So think about the answers, and all I want you to do is when you give me an answer, I want you to justify that particular answer. I promise you that in the memo it's going to be a reason, and any valid reason will be the kind of answer they're looking for. Right, have we answered all the questions? I just want to quickly go through this again. So we're looking at Mr. Chabalala, he's borrowing 16,000 Rand, and we need to calculate his final, how much he will finally repay if he takes the loan after 24 months. We've done that. Over 60 months, we've done that. And in general, do we advise him to take it for shorter or longer? And we've given a reason, so we've answered all that question. So let's move on to the next part of the question. Right, we've still got our same table. If he chooses the 60-month option, calculate the interest that he will pay over that period. So we've got our calculation of how much he paid in total. So we've basically got our A, that is our final value. That was, we'll go back to the last page to double check what that was. It was 28,200. So my accumulated value was 28,200. My principal amount that I started with was 16,000. And now I'm looking for my interest rate. And remember, that was the formula that I told you right at the beginning. We've basically got A equals to P plus I, or we're going to manipulate this formula and move P to the other side. So we're going to say I equals to A minus P. And now all I'm going to do is substitute my values into that. So my interest that he's paying is my accumulated value, which was 28,200, minus 16,000. And what is the final value? Well, I'm going to take my calculator to calculate that. I've already got that answer in my calculator. So all I need to do is minus my 16,000. And he's paying 12,200 Rand in interest. Okay, so his interest is 12,200 Rand. Right, have we answered the question correctly? If he chooses a 60-month option, calculate the interest that he'll pay over that period. We have answered. So let's move on to the next part of the question. Right, the loan repayments include insurance premium and administration fees. If Mr. Chabalala borrows the 16,000 Rand, how much of each month's payment is the premium and how much is the administration fee? So I remember reading that in the kind of the fine print. Well, it wasn't so fine, but that's the stuff that you would see underneath. So we looked at a monthly premium of R3.95 per thousand and an admin fee of R9.50. So what are they asking us? They're asking us for our premium and the admin fee. So my admin fee, well, that was easy. My admin fee is purely R9.50. Simple, calculated, don't even need to calculate it, just from the text. My premium was a little bit more complicated. I'm paying R3.95 per 1,000 Rand. So let's write that in as my premium is R3.95 per 1,000 Rand. So what I need to work out is how many 1,000 Rands have I got when I borrow, or Mr. Chabalala got when he borrows the 16,000 Rand. So I'm going to take my 16,000 Rand and divide it by 1,000 to find out how many of these he has got. So I'm going to use my calculator. I don't think you need to, but my 16,000 Rand and divide it by 1,000. And I see that there are 16 of these portions. So he basically has 16 1,000 Rands. And it was 3 Rand 95 per portion. It was 3 Rand 95 per 1,000. So I need to multiply that by 16. So I'm going to take my 16, which is now on my calculator, and times that by 3 Rand 95. And I get an answer of 63 Rand 20. Don't forget it's money. So let's go back here and write that in. So he pays 63 Rand. Remember, it is money. It's 2 decimal places. That 0 is very, very, very important. So it must be 2 decimal places. So it's 63 Rand and 20 cents. That is how much he pays. Have we answered the question? The loan repayment includes the insurance premium and the admin. If he borrows 16,000, how much of each month's payment is premium and how much is the admin fee? We have answered the question. They haven't asked us for a total, so we don't need to add the two. We need to just show them that the admin fee was 9 Rand 50 and the premium is now 63 Rand 20. Show all your calculations. I can't stress this enough. And explain what you're doing the way I did. I said I'm first looking at the admin fee, then I'm going to be looking at the premium. It just makes it easier for your teachers to understand what you're thinking so that they can pick up what you've done. Don't just give us an answer. Right, let's move on to the next part of the question. Mr. Chabalala has 2 other options for borrowing the money. Right, let's look at his first option. A friend has offered to lend him the 16,000 Rand. Let's get a color. For 16,000 Rand for 5 years at 18% per annum, and this is simple interest. What would the total cost for this option be at the end of 5 years? So we're going to be using simple interest, and we want to know what the total will be. So I'm going to be using my simple interest formula of the A equals to P, 1 plus I times N. And again, I'm going to write out all my values. So I've got A, P, I, and N. Let's go back. And we know that he was borrowing 16,000 Rand. We know that it was for 5 years. And remember, N needs to be in years. And what was the interest rate that was being charged? 18%. So let's write that in here as 18%. Or I want you to write it as a fraction, so 18 over 100. And now we're going to substitute that all into the formula. So we've got A equals to my 16,000 Rand, open my bracket, 1 plus 18 over 100 times 5. Right, and let's get our calculator out and use that on the calculator. So I've got my 16,000 Rand that he borrows, 1 plus my interest rate of 18%, and times it by 5 years. Close the bracket, and I get an answer of 30,400 Rand. So that's what he would need to pay his friend back after the 5 years. So let's write that into our solution. It was 30,000, I've lost that, 30,400 Rand. Right, we answered the question. We've looked at our first option. We've worked out at the end of the 5 years, he owes his friend 30,400 Rand. Let's move on to the next part of the question. He can go to the Criterion Bank and will lend him 16,000 Rand for 5 years at 16% per annum, compounded monthly. And now we want to determine the cost of this option. So what are we looking for? We're looking for compound interest. So I'm going to answer this. I'm going to first write out my formula. That's my formula. I'm also going to write out that my compounded was monthly. So it was monthly. I'm going to make a note of that, and it was 12. So I remember that I'm compounding it more than once a year. And now I'm going to do exactly what I've done before, and I'm going to write out all my values that I need, and we're going to calculate each one of these. Now, we'll lend him 16,000 Rand. So that is what they're giving him right now. That is his principal amount. So 16,000 Rand is his principal. The interest rate he's earning is 16%. I'm going to make it 16 over 100. And remember, I need my monthly, so I'm going to times that by 12. And then my number of years, well, we had it for 5 years. So it was 5 years, but it was 5 times 12, because we're looking at the compound periods, and in that case was 60. Now we can, let's get a little bit more space here, we can substitute that into the equation. So let's change our pen. Right, so we've got 16,000 Rand, open my bracket, 1 plus my fraction, which was 16 over 100 times 12, and all of that in the bracket to the power of 60. And now we're going to get out our calculator and type that all into the calculator. So it was 16,000 Rand, open my bracket, 1 plus my fraction, that's 16%, so 100, and it was monthly, close that bracket, all to the power of 60. And we get an answer, and it's 35,420 and 91 cents. Don't forget that 91 cents. So let's write that into my answer. It's equal to, I need a pen to do that. Right, 35,420 and 91 cents. So that is what he would have to pay back after the 5 years to this particular bank. Move on to the next part of the question. The next part of the question says, hence, recommend to Mr. Chabalala which of the 3 options would be best. So what are our 3 options? Well, the 2 options we've just discussed, borrowing from the bank and borrowing from his friend, and the third option was the original option that he had from that Samlo. So let's go back and see what those options were. So we had our Samlo, it was 28,200. So we can move forward and write that in. Next one was 28,200. From his friend, it was 30,400, and from the bank, that was the friend, from the bank was 35,420. So 35,420 and 91 cents. So which was his best option? Well, he's borrowing money and he has to pay that back. So we're going to go with the cheapest of the 3 options. So Samlo is the cheapest. So we're going to recommend that it's Samlo that he uses, and we're going to give a reason. They haven't asked for a reason, but we're always going to give a reason. So we're just going to say, well, that's the cheapest at the end of the day. Let's move on to our next question. Question number 2. The population in Gauteng increases from 1,358,000 in 1970 to 3,246,000 in 1990. Determine the annual compound growth rate of the population as a percentage. Now, this is the first time in the session that we're dealing with numbers and we're not dealing with a bank. But if we think about a population grows and as a percentage, and then it grows as a percentage and carries on growing as a percentage. So it is basically compound interest, or it's compound growth. So maybe we won't use the interest in this question, but we will say it's compound growth. But my formula is exactly the same. So I'm looking for the compound growth, and I'm going to be looking at my formula as A is P 1 plus I to the power of N. Right, again, I'm going to write out all my values, A, P, I, and N. Right, what do I know? Let's go back to the question. I know that the population increased from that amount, so this must be my principal value. So I'm going to write that into my P. So I've got 1358 and 3 zeros. And then it increased to that amount. So that is my final value, or my accumulated amount. So that is A. So I've got 3246 and my 3000s. I'm looking for the compound determine the rate. I'm looking for my interest. And my number of years, well, I know it's from 1970 to 1990, which makes it, let's just do a quick calculation, 1990 minus 1970, well, I can see that it is 20 years. So my time is 20 years. Okay, now let's substitute this into the equation, and we're going to write it out exactly the way the equation's written. So I've got my A on that side, and then I've got my equal sign, my P, 1358 and 3 zeros, open bracket 1 plus. Now I'm looking for my I, and this is what I don't have. But remember earlier we were dealing with I basically over 100. So I'm going to write that in as I over 100, okay, and to the power of 20. Now we need to manipulate this formula so that we get I on its own. So what we're going to do is we need to get I on its own. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of my P, my principal amount. So the way I'm going to do that is, and the way we manipulate a formula is whatever we do to one side, we do to the other. So I'm basically going to take this and I'm going to divide it by 1358 and 3 zeros, because then those cancel out. And what I do to the one side, I need to do to the other side. So I basically have my fraction is equal to my brackets. So what I can actually do now is I can delete these two because they actually have been cancelled out. So I've got my fraction is equal to my bracket. My bracket is to the power of 20. So I need to do the opposite of that. So I'm going to root it to the power of 20, and I'm going to do that to the other side as well. These two then cancel out. At this point, I'm actually going to rewrite this. So I've got my root 20, and I've got my fraction, 32, if I can remember how to write, 3246, and 3 zeros divided by 1358 and 3 zeros. I can see now that my zeros can be cancelled, but I'm going to leave them for now because my calculator can do all that. So I'm not going to worry about doing too much maths where I'm not using my calculator. And this is now equal to only my bracket. Right, but I still don't have I on its own. I need to still carry on manipulating. But my bracket is no longer needed because I don't have a power any longer. So I can actually delete my brackets. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to move this 1 to the other side of the brackets, of the equal sign, and I'm going to change the sign. So I'm going to rewrite this as my root 20. I've got my 3246 and 3 zeros divided by 1358 and 3 zeros, and minus 1 is now equals to I over 100. At this stage, I'm actually going to start doing the calculations on my calculator. Up until this point, I haven't needed my calculator. So let's now get the calculator out, and we're going to, first of all, we need to find this root button. So it is a second function, and it is that button that we're looking for. So we're going to do our 20. Then under the square root sign, or the root sign, I'm going to put a fraction. So I've got my 3246 and 123, and at the bottom I've got my 1358 and 3 zeros. Then I'm going to minus my 1. Now be careful when you minus 1. If you just type minus 1, it's going to extend your root sign, and I don't want that. So we actually need to move our cursor over or press equals at this stage. But my minus 1 needs to not be under the root sign. And I'm going to press equals. Right, and I get an answer of 0,0445. I'm going to write it down on my page now, and I'm not clearing this and I'm not rounding off. And I'm going to just write this in. So what I basically have now is I've got 0,044, and there was a whole lot of other numbers, is equal to I over 100. To get I on its own, I'm going to multiply by 100 because then those cancel. So I'm going to multiply this side by 100. I'll go back to my calculator, and all I'm going to do there is I'm going to say my answer times by 100, and I get an answer of 4,45%. And what's great about multiplying by 100 is my answer is in a percentage already. So let's write that number in. So my solution was now I is equal to 4,45%. Have I answered the question? Let's go back and double check. Well, the question was determine the annual compound growth rate of the population as a percentage. So I have answered my question. I have a growth rate as a percentage. Right, let's move on to the next part of this question. If the same annual growth rate is maintained, determine the population in Gauteng in the year 2050. So we're looking at the same annual growth rate. So basically we're looking at what we've just calculated before as my R was equal to 4,45%. That is what I am basing my calculation on now. Now this is an important fact I want to tell you all. Let's assume you couldn't calculate your interest rate. Don't leave out these 3 marks. It's important that you continue with the question. But if I don't know the growth rate that I had calculated, how am I going to answer the question? And what I want to tell you to do now is I want to tell you to assume an answer. So you can actually write in your paper, and you can write down so that the examiner knows exactly what you're doing. You say, I couldn't answer point 1, but now I'm assuming that I is equal to 10% or 5% or any percentage that you choose. It can be a total random number. But you will get method marks for every step, and in fact you could get all 3 marks for this question even though you have used the wrong growth rate. So we are still using our compound interest, so I'm going to write out my formula again, 1 plus r to the power of n. And now again, writing out all the values. Right, I is what I've calculated, 4,45%, or 4,45 over 100. My principal is now what was the growth rate at the last stage, because I'm looking at from 1990 to 2050. So I'm looking at 1990's growth rate, which was our principal. So my principal becomes this 3,246, and 3 zeros. I'm looking for my final value, my accumulated value, and the number of years. Well, in this case, we've got 2050 minus 1990, which I can see is 60 years. So my n is 60. Let's find a little bit more space, and we're going to substitute into our formula. We're looking for A is 3,246 and 3 zeros, 1 plus my interest rate of 4,45 over 100 to the power of 60. Remember, it was compounded annually, so I don't have to worry about changing the compound periods or the interest rate. And now take out the calculator. Let's clear that. We've got a 3,246, and be careful when you're typing in these really big numbers. Just double check that you've actually got the number correct and that you've typed it in correctly. Open my bracket, 1 plus my interest rate, 4,45 divided by 100. Close that bracket, and to the power of 60 years, and I get an answer of 4. Okay, and I'm going to start counting from my 0 back. So I've got 44,244,080,56. So let's type that in. Let's go back to the notes. So A was equal to 44,244,080, and there was a comma 56. Now, does it make sense? I can't speak about half a person. I'm either going to have less or more. So because it's 0.56, I'm going to round up. So my actual answer will be, well, there'll be 44,244,081. And those are people in Gauteng in the year 20,50. Have I answered the question? It says, if the same annual growth rate is maintained, determine the population in Gauteng in the year 2050. We have answered the question. Right, let's move on to the next one. How much must Peter deposit in a bank if he needs 9,500 for an air ticket in 3 years' time and the interest rate is 11.3% per annum compounded quarterly? So we're looking for the amount that he needs to deposit in a bank. We know what he wants at the end of the day. So this is my accumulated value. That's what he needs to buy the air ticket. So again, I've got compound interest. So write out the formula and then fill in all the values that I know. So I've got A, P, I, and N. So we're looking for, he needs 9,500. We're looking for how much he needs to invest now. So my principal amount is my question mark. We've got our interest rate was 11.3%. It was compounded quarterly. So I forgot to write that it was quarterly, and that means it is 4. So I'm going to make this 11.3 over 100 times by 4. Remember, I need to divide it by 4 times, and we've got 3 years. So my N was 3 years, but it is 4 times in the year, which is 12. And now we're going to plug that into our formula. So writing out the formula exactly the way that it was. So I've got 9,500 is equal to P, open my bracket, 1 plus 11.3 over 100 times 4 to the power of 12. Now we need to, again, manipulate this formula. So we need to get P on its own. So to get P on its own, let's try a different color. To get P on its own, I'm going to divide by everything that it's multiplied by. And in this case, it is my brackets. So if I divide by my bracket, then those brackets cancel out, but I need to divide on the other side by the bracket. And I'm going to show you 2 different ways of actually calculating this on your calculator. So let's now get our calculator out. Let's leave that number there. So we've basically got P, and we're going to get an answer now. Our calculator will do it for us. So the first thing I can do is, this is a fraction. So I'm going to use my fraction button. And I'm going to type it in exactly the way it is in my notes. So 9,500 divided by, and I'm going to open my brackets here, 1 plus, and a fraction, 11.3 divided by 100 times by 4. What I want you to note, and please be careful of this, your calculator, when you do too many fractions, tends to get slow. So don't type and assume that you've typed the number correctly. Double check as you're typing that it actually is appearing as you want it to. Okay, we need to close the bracket. I need the bracket over the entire fraction, so I'm going to delete that and move my cursor over a little bit and then close the bracket, and I want that to the power of 12. And I'm going to press equals and I'll get my answer. So it was 6,847 cents. So that's my answer. So we can type that in here. It was 6,847 cents. So that is what he needs to invest now so that he's got enough money in 3 years' time to go on his trip. I said I was going to show you 2 ways to calculate this. So let's do the other way. The other way is to calculate my bracket first. So I'm going to type in my bracket 1 plus my fraction, 11.3 divided by 100 times by 4, close that bracket to the power of 12. So once I've calculated my bracket, get a number for that. I'm now going to take 95,000 divide by that answer. If I write it into my book, I'm probably going to tend to round off. Now your calculator keeps all these decimals, so we're going to use the calculator and its ability to remember all these rather than writing it into the book. So And what I need to do now is I need to take 9,500 and divide by that answer. So without clearing your calculator, and this is an important fact, don't clear your calculator. You type in 9,500 and divide it by the answer that I received before, and I get an answer exactly the same, 6,847. Now, you can use either method to do these calculations, but I suggest that you decide on which method you're going to use and continue using that method so you practice with it. So when you do your homework today, I want you to use one or the other method, but stick to one. Right, now we know how much he needed. Let's double check that we've answered the question correctly. How much must he deposit in a bank if he needs that in 3 years' time? We have got an answer of how much he must deposit. So let's move on to the next question. We need C. Right. Kelly buys a couch for 3,500 Rand. So I'm going to highlight all our numbers here. She buys a couch for 3,500, a coffee table for 1,200, and 2 wingback chairs for 1,470 Rand each for her new lounge. She takes the good on hire purchase. I haven't discussed hire purchase yet, so this would be a good point to do it. Hire purchase is when you go to a store to buy goods, you normally pay a deposit and then you've got an extended period of time to pay off the goods. It makes it more affordable, you cheaper at the time, you don't have to lay out the full amount of money and you don't have to borrow the money from the bank. You're basically getting into an agreement with that company. So she's borrowed this on hire purchase. Hire purchase normally works on simple interest. She pays a 20% deposit and she's charged 13.5% per annum simple interest. She decides to take 3 years to pay the loan off. Calculate her monthly installments. So we're going to take this one step at a time. There's a lot of information here, so let's break it down. First of all, how much is she actually paying for her lounge furniture? So let's do that first calculation. So we had a couch of 3,500. She had a coffee table of 1,200. And she had 2 wingback chairs at 1,470 each. So that'll give us the total that she paid for all these goods. So we're going to get our calculator out, and 3,500 plus 1,200 plus 2 times 1,470, and we get an answer. She pays 7,640 Rand for her lounge furniture. 7,640 Rand. That is what her lounge furniture is worth. She pays a deposit. So how much deposit did she pay? She paid a 20% deposit. So let's calculate what her deposit was. So we're going to take that and we're going to times it by 20%. So on my calculator, I've already got my answer. So times that by 20. And we see that she pays 1,528 Rand deposit. Her deposit was 1,528 Rand. That's what she paid in deposit. So what she still owes the company that she's going to be taking on simple interest is the balance of the original amount that she bought the furniture for minus her deposit. So we're going to calculate that, the 7,640 minus her deposit of 1,528, and she actually is borrowing, so let's that. I've got that answer in my calculator, so I'm going to not clear, I'm going to say 7,640 minus my answer, and it gives me, she basically owes the company still 6,112. So she owes them 6,112. Now we've calculated what she needs to borrow. Let's go back to the question. So we've calculated how much she pays, we've calculated her deposit. She is charged 13.5% per annum simple interest, and she decides to take 3 years to pay the loan off. Calculate her monthly installments. So what I need to do now is I need to first work out what is the total that she has to pay for these goods, and then we're going to divide it by how many months she takes to pay it off. So I'm going to use my simple interest formula, and I'm going to use my total simple interest formula, which was my principal, 1 plus IN. And again, I'm going to write out all the values that I need. Right, we're looking for what she owes them in total. The amount that she's borrowing from them is not the total amount, it is minus her deposit. So it was the 6,112, and that's rands. Her interest rate, we're going back to the question, was 13.5%. So 13.5, or as I'd rather you write it, 13.5 over 100. And how many years? It was 3 years. And now that I've got all the information, all I need to do is calculate what A is. So we're going to type that into my equation. 6112, open brackets, 1 plus 13.5 over 100 and times my 3. Right, and now let's use a calculator to get that answer for us. So it was 6112, open brackets, 1 plus my fraction, 13.5, divided by 100, times by 3 years, and we see that she has to pay back 8,587 Rand and 36 cents. So let's write that number into our equation, into our notes. So A was 8,587 Rand and 36 cents. Did we answer the question? Well, we've calculated how much she pays in total, but the question said calculate her monthly installments. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take that total that she owes the company and we're going to divide it by how many months. So I'm going to take that answer and divide it by, there were 3 years that she's paying it off, but she's paying monthly. So we're basically going to be dividing it by 36 months. And I've got my answer on my calculator, so all I need to do is divide by 36, and I get my answer. She's paying back 238 Rand and 54 cents per month. Remember to round off to 2 decimal places. So she has to pay back an amount of 238 Rand and 54 cents per month. Right, let's go back and check. We've answered all the question we needed to about Kelly. She bought the furniture. We know what she bought. We decided we're done up to there. Then she pays 20% deposit. She's charged 13.5% per annum, simple interest. She takes it over a 3-year period, calculate her monthly installment. So we have answered the question. And now we know how much she must pay per month. Let's move on to the next question. Determine the compound interest rate per annum in order for money to double in value over a period of 6 years. Now, when I read this question, kind of bells are going off in my head. There doesn't seem to be enough information. They haven't given me too many numbers. So all I know is that I want my money to double, and I've got 6 years, and I'm looking for my interest rate. So what I'm doing is, first of all, this is compound interest. So I'm going to write out my formula, and now I'm going to start thinking about, well, all my values. So I've got my A, P, R, and N. Right, what do I know? I know that N is 6 years, and I know that it's compounded per annum, so I'm not worrying about the compound periods. I know that I'm looking for my interest rate, but I don't seem to have a principal value or a final value. So I need to come back to this word, money will double. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a random amount of money. So easiest for me is basically if I take 100 Rand. Now if I want my money to double, then my accumulated value will basically be double that. So it will be 200 Rand. And it could use any number, absolutely any number that you want, as long as your A is 2 times your P. So now that I've got all my values, all I'm going to do is substitute it into my formula. So I've got 200 is equal to 100, open my bracket, 1 plus, remember I want I over 100 to the power of 6. And now we're going to do the same thing that we did in the last question. We're going to manipulate it to get I on its own. So I'm going to divide by 100, because then those cancel. divide by 100. I'm going to root it to the power of 6. So I'm going to redraw that. So I'm going to have 6. My 200 over 100 is now equal to 1 plus I over 100. I'm now going to move my 1 over to the other side. So I'm going to move that. So I'm going to have my root 6, 200 over 100 minus 1. And that's going to be equal to I over 100. And I'm going to actually do this in one step now. I'm going to times this by 100. But what I need to note is on the other side, I need to multiply this entire thing by 100. So I'm going to use brackets. When you're doing your calculations, maybe a good idea for doing it on the calculator is to actually press equals along the way. So let's do that when we press equals. So now I've basically got I on its own. So we're going to be substituting all of this into the calculator. So my calculator, and I'm going to do it with equal signs. I'll show you where we press the equal signs. I need that particular button. So I've got the power of 6, and then inside my root sign, I've got a fraction of 200, that's not 200, of 200 divided by 100. Right, I'm going to now press equals. Makes it easier. So I've done this step, and then I've pressed equals. Now I'm going to minus 1, press equals, and then I'm going to times by 100 and equals. So I get 12.25%. Remember, round off to 2 decimal places. So my answer here is 12.25%. Let's just quickly recap where we pressed equals. I'm going to rewrite, I'm going to use a different color. So I did this part first, and I pressed equals. Then I minused the 1, and I pressed equals. Then I times by 100, and I pressed equals, and I got my final answer. So it's one of those things that you need to practice with your calculator. You need to practice how your calculator works, and make sure that you understand what steps you're doing every step of the way. Right. Have we answered the question? It says determine the compound interest rate per annum in order for money to double in value over a period of 6 years. I have done that. If you'd like, you can actually at this point go and double check to see that you are correct. So how would we double check? Well, we'll take our simplest form of the equation, which is basically calculating A. So if I took an amount of money, and let's work out A, and I took an amount of money, and it could have been any amount. So let's take a different amount now. Let's make it 50 Rand. And I'm going to press Y, 1 plus, and use the answer that I got to the power of 6. And if I put that into my calculator, I'm expecting A to be 100. So let's check that I actually am right. So I'm going to take my 50 Rand, 1 plus my fraction, 12.25 over 100 to the power of 6, and I get an answer of 100 Rand. Well, I've got a couple of cents, but I have doubled my money, so I know that I'm correct. Why have I got a couple of cents? Well, my answer was 12.246, and I rounded up, so that's why I've got my few cents difference. So I know that my answer is correct. And it's really nice when you're doing calculations like this, if you have the ability to check that you are correct, because with my checking, I have realized that I have achieved all of these 5 marks, that I actually have got the correct answer. And it's nice to be able to do that. Right, let's move on to our next question. Our next question is, Mr. Nkosi wants to open a small cafe on the corner of Church Street. He needs the following to start his business. He needs buying of initial stock of 80,000 Rand, and that's a once-off fee. He's got rent of 6,000 Rand per month. Your infrastructure of 12,750, and that's also a once-off fee. He pays salaries of 288,000 per annum, and he's got running costs, that's transport, electricity, and all other things like that, of 2,420 per month. Now, when I read these this information, I realized that there's a lot of things happening in this question. There's a lot of things that I need to look at. First of all, I've got 2 once-off fees, which I basically know he's going to pay at the beginning and he's not going to pay again. I've also then got per month and per month, which is perfect. And then I've got another one of per annum. So I realized that there are different criteria for each one of these things that they've given me. And I need to bear that in mind when I answer the question. So let's start and see what the question asks. How much does he need to cover his expenses for the first month? And show all your calculations. Now, in the first month of his business, we can go back and check that. He's opening the business. He needs to start. We need to buy the initial stock, and we need to pay the once-off fee for the infrastructure. So in his first month, he has much higher expenses than the rest. So let's go through, and we need to cover his for the first month. We also need to check, well, I had one amount that was per annum. So before I calculate his first month fees, I need to work out how much are his salaries per month. So I'm going to do that calculation first. His per annum was 288,000 Rand, and we've got 12 months in a year. So let's calculate what that is per month. I'm going to use our calculator. We've got 28,123 divided by 12, and I get an answer of 24,000 Rand per month that he pays in fees, in salaries. 24,000 Rand. Now that I've got that converted, this is per month, I can basically add up all his fees. So let's do that. We've got an initial fee of 80,000 Rand. So we're going to have to 80,000 Rand plus, and I'm going to go in order, 6,000 Rand per month for rent, plus he's got his infrastructure of 12,750. That's not 12,000. 12,750 plus, I'm going to have to move to the next line, infrastructure. My salary per annum, we've just calculated as 24,000, plus he's got running costs of 2,420. And that'll basically give me his initial fee. So on the calculator, I can type those all in. I've got my 80,000 plus the 6,000. That's not 6,000. Be careful. It's very easy to make a mistake when you're typing in a number. So always double check your calculator. Always check that you've got the right number and you've got the correct number of zeros. 6,000 and plus 12,750. Then we've got our salaries that we calculated, 24,000 plus 2,420. And finally, he has to pay an amount of 125,170 Rand. So let's write that into our notes. So it was 125,170 Rand. Have we answered the question? It says calculate his monthly expenses for his first month. We have done that. I suggest, and I didn't do it, but I suggest that you make notes along the way to show the examiner what you do, and you can go back and do it after the question. So this was just his salary, so that the examiner knows exactly what you're doing, and then this was his total, and our answer was what he needed. Right, let's see what else he needs to do. Mr. Nkosi opens a small, okay, the Corner Street, we've got that. Buying his initial stock, right. In order to cover all of these expenses, he will have to take out a loan from Absa Bank. He wants to borrow 125,170 and repay it over a period of 3 years. Now, that number is rather interesting because that is the number that we calculated for his initial costs. So clearly, another good point, we know that our answer was correct. So, and very often when you're doing these calculations and you're working through a multi-step question, the second or third part tells you how much your original was. So we know that we had question A correct. Let's see what his options for borrowing are. He has two options. Options 1 was 14.5% interest per year, compounded quarterly. And option 2 was 13.5% interest, compounded monthly. And they give you the formula. They're going to give you the formula in the exam. So we've got the formula. How long did he want to borrow it for? We're going to have to go back and reread this. He needs to cover, that's our principal amount, and he's borrowing it for 3 years. So for each option, calculate the total amount he would have to pay over the 3-year period. So let's go through and do these calculations. So first of all, I'm going to do option 1. And option 1, I've got my formula. I know it's in the question, but I suggest you get into the habit of rewriting it. Then I've got A, P, I, and N. A is what I'm looking for. My principal amount was how much he needs to borrow. So that's my principal, which was 125,170. The interest rate for option A, or option 1, was 14.5%. So 14.5%, which I want to make it 14.5 over 100. Compounded quarterly. So for this, we need to know that it was quarterly, which means it was 4. So I'm going to times that by 4. And our time frame was 3 years. So N is 3, or in this case, quarterly, so it is 12. And now we're going to substitute that into the equation. 125,170, open brackets, 1 plus 14.5 over 100 times 4 to the power of 12. Let's use our calculator. So it was 125,170, open brackets, 1 plus my fraction, 14.5 over 100 times 4. Close the bracket to the power of 12. And I get an answer of 191,899. So we can write that in. Pen. So this is what he's going to owe at the end of the day, at the end of the 3 years. And now we need to do option 2. So let's change our color of our pen. So option 2. Right, I've got my formula. And A, P, I, and N. Right, my principal was the same. My number of years was the same. I'm looking for A, and let's look at interest rate. For this was 13.5%, and it was compounded monthly. So I need to know that it's monthly, which means it's 12. So, and it was 13.5%, or make it 13,5 over 100 times by 12. Now on my calculator, I'm going to write it. That's 125,170, 1 plus 13.5 over 100 times 12 to the power of, let's make it as 3 times 12 in this case. Right, let's get the calculator out. And we're going to the same number, 125,170, open my bracket, 1 plus, my percentage was 13.5, divided by 100 times by 12, close the brackets to the power of 3 times 12, or 36. And I get an answer of 187,243 Rand and 82 cents. So let's write that in. So A equals to 187,243 Rand and 82 cents. Right, let's see, have we check to see we have answered the question. So the question says, for each option, calculate the total amount he would have to pay over the 3-year period. We have, in fact, answered the question because we know that's what he needs to pay for the first option and that's what he needs to pay for the second option. So now let's see what it tells us. Now we've got to motivate which option will be best for Mr. Nkosi. So we're going to go back to our calculations and check which one is best. Option 1, he needed to pay 191,000 odd, and in option 2 was 187,000. Now remember, he is borrowing the money from the bank, so he wants to pay back the lesser amount. So we're going to motivate here that we believe that he should take option 2. And why? Because it is cheaper. Or he has to pay back, pay back less money. Right, and now we've answered our question. Right, that takes us to the end of our questions. Now there are exercises for you to do later or for you to do at home. So when you're doing these, what I want you to remember is always write out the formula, write out everything that you need and everything that you've been given in the question before you actually go ahead and do the calculations. Be careful that you enter the correct number onto your calculator. Double check your calculator as you're working. Practice using your calculator, even if you have to do the same question over and over again, just so that you know exactly how your calculator works, because it'll make it easier for you, kind of less anxious when you get to the exam. There are certain questions that you can double check, so do a simpler calculation to check that you've got the right answer. I want you to work through the questions methodically and kind of read it, reread it, highlight the numbers so that you know what those numbers are. And always remember to go back and double check the question that you've actually answered exactly what they're asking. And lastly, just remember, if you can't do part A of a question, but it's relying on that answer for part B of a question, then make an assumption. Assume a number. Just tell the examiner that you have assumed whatever the number was, and then you will continue to get method marks from there. So good luck with that, and I hope to see you soon.